Welcome to the Lawyers Talk Show on TASC TV, the voice of the Turkish American community. I am the host, attorney Erol Gulistan. March is Women's History Month, commemorating and encouraging the study, observance, and celebration of the vital role of women in American history. According to Policy Brief, the impact of COVID-19 on women by the United Nations, a pandemic amplifies and heightens all existing inequalities. And these inequalities in turn shape who is affected, the severity of the impacts, and our efforts at recovery. The COVID-19 pandemic and its social and economic impacts have created a global crisis which requires a whole of society response to match its sheer scale and complexity. But this response, whether at the national or international level, will be significantly weakened if it does not factor in the ways in which inequalities have made all of us more vulnerable to the impacts of the crisis. Working mothers, in particular, have been the and we will discuss along with accompanying legal issues affecting women and all people in society. And it's even said that single parents, especially single moms, are more like tenfold affected by this issue. Our guest today is New York attorney, Ms. Yasemin Ekici, who is the owner of her own law practice, Ekici are Tukmaç Attorneys in New York. Thank you for coming on the show, Ms. Ekici, and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Gülistan. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here today.
You're welcome. Or as we say in Turkish, as you know, hoş geldiniz.
Hoş buldum.
Ms. Ekici, where did you grow up and what was it like?
I grew up, I was born in, I lived in Manhattan until I was about 4 or 5 years old, and then we moved out to the suburbs of Long Island. I'm a child of 2 Turkish immigrant parents. It was very, we were probably the only immigrant family at the time back then, and in the neighborhood that I grew up in. So it wasn't a very diverse experience, so to speak. But we were able to travel back to the city and in Manhattan and Brooklyn, where there is an extensive Turkish American community. So we were able to sort of maintain our roots there.
Yes. And what inspired you to be an attorney?
That's actually a very, it's a very quirky story. My godmother, she's an attorney. And from the age of 4 or 5, before I could even say lawyer, I would pronounce it lawyer. I said I wanted to become an attorney and followed that throughout elementary school, high school, college, and subsequently law school.
Excellent. And tell our audience a little bit about your law practice.
My partner, Emrah Artukmaç, and I have been in practice together since 2008. I graduated in 2006 with a JD degree. I mostly handle matrimonial and family law cases in our firm, as well as the immigration cases. My partner is a former district attorney in Suffolk County, and he handles the criminal law cases and our real estate cases. And we do quite a bit of also business law, corporate law transactions.
Excellent. And when you mention family law, because I know a lot of times I get clients or prospective clients and they get thrown off when they hear family law. What does that exactly encompass? Does it encompass divorce, custody? What does it encompass exactly?
Sure, Errol. Actually, it can be all of the above. Family law and matrimonial law, it can involve divorce, or it could involve parties who have custody of a particular child or children who are not married or are divorced and have other issues that need to be relitigated subsequent to their divorce. It is a very sensitive area for a lot of people, understandably so, because it involves your family.
Yes, definitely. And they are very sensitive matters. Now, A lot of us attorneys have had, plethora of stories, whether it be the good, the bad, or a third category. Now, what is the most memorable experience you've had as an attorney?
Gosh, there's so many memorable experiences. And for me, what stands out the most was my first Supreme Court trial. It was a pro bono divorce case that we took on right out of law school. I was working for a different matrimonial law firm in Midtown. And I was assigned this case from inception to the trial. And working with my client and subsequently forming a bond and a relationship with her and seeing the gratitude at the end and having sort of the best successful, if you could coin it that, best case scenario outcome after the trial. It was in Bronx County, I'll never forget. It was just a very both humbling and rewarding experience because, and again, I'm going to get into, it sort of ties into the memorable experience. I was caught writing a note on the palm of my hand, and the judge at the time, I'm not going to mention her name, but she's now in the appellate division. She said, "Ms. Ekici, do you need a piece of paper? Because I could lend you one." And from that day forward, I never wrote another note on my hand again.
So it was very much a very caring approach that the judge took in that case and offered you handwriting material that you can write down some things on. So that's an amazing story.
Absolutely.
So now, as you know, being an attorney, along with many other careers, and can be stressful. What are the ways to manage stress in a career that can have these sorts of challenges?
Yes, and I don't think our career is the only career that we have these challenges. But what's most important is that you need to realize you're not alone, that we're not alone. The emotions that we're feeling, the stress that we're feeling, the psychological impact that it may be having on us, it's not just your problem. It's pretty probably your colleagues sitting to the left of you, to the right of you, and behind you. So the most important thing is don't be ashamed to ask for help, whether it's a shoulder to cry on or professional help, whether it's a therapist to sort of decompress and realize that we're human beings at the end of the day, and we have a plethora of emotions, and it is a very high stress job because we're also carrying the emotions and the stresses of our clients. So that will definitely carry over, and you need to sort of decompress, take a step back. And some people like to go to the gym, some people like to take mini vacations, but the most important thing is don't ever sacrifice your personal life or your family life, particularly during stressful times, as we've all experienced tenfold in the last year during the pandemic.
Yes. And I'm a big advocate on the exercise part that you mentioned, because I notice a tremendous benefit anytime, whether it's something as simple as going for half an hour walk, or even for a jog. It makes a very big difference in terms of how, I feel, or anyone feels for that matter on a stressful day. It can really have a beneficial impact or effect. So I would strongly encourage all of our viewers to take up those positive, methods of reducing stress. And thank you for your honest answer.
You're welcome.
And the next question we have here is, what are some of the most common legal issues Turkish American families are facing in the United States at the moment?
Well, I don't think it's anything that's any different. I don't think let's take a step back. All families of all nationalities and all heritages are facing the exact same problems, whether it's legal issues tied to perhaps being laid off during COVID, which they are legally justified, or seeking family leave pay. But I don't think that Turkish Americans in particular, we should really single them out and say that they have any. We're all going through the same crisis and we're all experiencing the same problems, basically.
Very well. And that's a very, very good point that you bring up. Now, I know that you are a divorce attorney in New York, among other practice areas. And I'm a divorce attorney in New Jersey, among other practice areas. And there are a variety of reasons why people get divorced, whether it's from infidelity to an extramarital affair, or lack of support to financial issues and beyond. Based on what you have seen in divorce cases,
maybe it's the connection on my end.
Right.
I'm sorry, Errol. We lost contact there for about 5 seconds.
Yes. So I was just summarizing here, based on what you've seen in divorce cases representing clients, what are the most common reasons why people get divorced today?
I would say it's 4 or 5 reasons. Communication, and not necessarily in that order. Communication problems, infidelity, abuse, unfortunately, financial or economic hardships, or not being able to, or not seeing eye to eye on financial and economic issues. I would say that those probably are the top 5 categories.
And if you had to say like one particular reason was the top reason, would you be able to say that it comes down to like one factor, or is it usually a combination of things?
I would say it's multifactorial, and a lot of it has a snowball effect. Let's say if there's lack of communication, there's lack of quality time, problems aren't discussed, and then things start to fester, and small problems that are unresolved start to grow exponentially into larger problems. And I don't think it's one particular thing. I think it's just it's a systematic breakdown of the relationship.
Yes. And there was a study that was done on this topic by the National Center for Biotechnology Information. And they analyzed all of the reasons that people had given for why they divorced. And they did a study in which they polled limited number of people involving a technique called PrEP, Prevention and Relationship Enhancement Program, that focused on teaching couples communication and conflict resolution skills. And the course took place before the couples wed, but the study surveyed individuals that ended up divorced 14 years after the program took place. And it aimed to extract information from various sources on why their marriages failed and whether it had been a combination of factors or due to a final straw. And here are their results on the most common reasons why people divorce according to their study based on individual responses. Number 11, little or no premarital education. Number 10, religious differences. 9, lack of support from family. 8, health problems. 7, domestic violence. Number 6, substance abuse, including drugs and alcohol. Number 5, financial problems. Number 4, getting married too young. Number 3, too much conflict and arguing. Number 2, infidelity or extramarital affairs. And the number 1 reason why people get divorced is lack of commitment. What are your thoughts and feelings on this study, Ms. Ekici?
I think it is fairly accurate. Not having read the study, my apologies. I think the lack of commitment sort of is the umbrella of, it encompasses both, whether it's infidelity, lack of communication, financial hardships. I think it's a catch-all sort of category for all of them, and I think it's very accurate. Because if there's infidelity, there's no commitment. If there's lack of communication, or people aren't, or couples aren't discussing their problems, or they're not seeing eye to eye, that's also sort of a lack of commitment, because they may be throwing their hands up and saying, oh, why should I bother? So that is sort of a lack of commitment. So I think there's a lot of veracity to the report.
Yes. And also, that report also, referenced some other reports. And I noticed that, people who had mentioned age, that the average age of people who cited that they were too young when they got married, their average age at the time of marriage was 23.3 years old. And according to the Pew Research Center, marriage age has changed drastically over the last 50 years. In 1960, 59% of those aged 18 to 29 in the U.S. were married. And then 50 years later, in 2010, that number dropped to 20%. And now, at least 10 years ago in 2011, the median age for marriage for a man was 28.7, and for a woman it was 26.5. So when is the right time to get married, in your opinion? And is there such a thing as a right age?
It's interesting you should mention that. The right age for marriage, there is a study out there, and there are theories out there, and according to recent statistics, and I think it was in Time magazine, it's called the Goldilocks Theory, and don't shoot the messenger, this is not my theory, that the perfect age is apparently, with the least likelihood of divorce in the first 5 years, is between the ages of 28 and 32. Now, again, if you're older than that, please, this is not my theory. They just call it the Goldilocks Theory, that if you're not getting married too young and you're not getting married too high up in years. Let's not use the old word.
Yes, we want to remain, open to.
So I don't think there is a right age per se, based on my opinion. I think a person should certainly have certain things in place personally before they're married. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, but I mean, you should be mature enough where you know that you get along with someone and you're not basing it purely on emotions and hormones, and that you've taken on some substantial responsibilities, whether it's a job, school, a career, so that you know that you can take on a huge responsibility such as a marriage. And I think also, to add to that, you should be financially solvent. And this may be controversial, but hear me out on this. Because as COVID has demonstrated, a lot of families have lost either one or both incomes. And when you're married, you may lose that one income, and you need to be financially solvent enough to maintain your spouse and your children. So in order to avoid getting divorced based on financial and economic hardships, I think some of these things should be in place.
Yes. So you're saying then it doesn't really come down to necessarily an age, but more so having certain things in place that help to provide stability and security, for that family unit, you're saying?
Right. I mean, it's not a mathematical formula. No, I mean, I don't want marriage to seem so contractual. It is very subjective, of course, without a doubt. I mean, love should definitely factor into this, for sure, absolutely. So I think that's probably why they said between 28 and 32. But just based on studies and how the level of education that a person has, and the number of years they've been out of school or with their career, there's a direct correlation between the likelihood of divorce. Again, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, but I don't think it's a right age. I think someone, it's an individual choice, first and foremost, couple's choice, whether they should marry, but I don't have a right age for marriage per se.
Right. And thank you for your honesty on that. That was a very tough question.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So, the closing of childcare centers and the shift to remote schooling has had an impact on mothers across the world. That has saddled working mothers, much more than fathers, with overwhelming household responsibilities. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, working mothers average an additional 26 hours of childcare responsibilities a week, and fathers average an additional 15 hours of childcare responsibilities, according to a recent study. With added childcare responsibilities, parents are finding themselves having to make a choice whether to prioritize commitments to their work or their children. What can be done in terms of legal protections or other solutions to help working mothers and fathers fulfill their duties to their children and not face undue pressure by employers?
Errol, yes, we've definitely lived this firsthand this past year. We really, our country unfortunately doesn't have an infrastructure of care that's publicly supported in our country in a robust enough way. In World War II, for example, Congress did pass funding for childcare so that the women could go into the factories to produce fighter planes and combat gear. But once the men came back from the front line, that funding was, the program was dismantled. So unfortunately, caregiving has been to date assumed to be a private responsibility, that it's not, or schools, public school system or private school education was seen as sort of childcare. But the pandemic has really forced us to realize that caregiving is not just a private matter. It affects the entire workforce, particularly women in the workforce. And that starts to trickle down because women in the workforce, it's shown in studies that women drive the economy. And without women driving the economy, we're going to start regressing.
And you're right about that. The next topic that I have here actually covers that. So, and according to the Census Bureau, in October of 2020, a third of working women aged 25 to 44 are unemployed. And the reason are the childcare demands that we had mentioned before. Many women, they express frustration and they want to go back to the workforce. And we know and have known, as you mentioned a moment ago, long before the pandemic, that women, are increasingly integral both to the economy and for the economic security of their families. Now, like you said, it's been one of the primary drivers of economic growth in the U.S. Women's increasing participation in the workforce. So women going back into the workforce, it makes our economy and society much stronger. So what can help women get back into the workforce, and how can we do this?
I think as much as we may be opposed to anything that's universal, whether it's universal health care or a universal child care system, child care is very expensive in our country. And in particular states, it's cost prohibitive. I mean, a woman's entire salary may be spent on child care. So that's where she says, well, I'm not going to sacrifice my child's childhood and not be there for them if I'm spending my entire paycheck on childcare. So you're sort of caught in a catch-22. So I think we need to implement more affordable childcare, and I think this is where the government needs to come in, where we can have a nationalized childcare system in place, so that we don't have to choose between our children and our career.
And that's a great idea. I mean, that's actually one of the most brilliant ideas I've heard in a long time. And I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Julie Cashin, Director for Women's Economic Justice at the Century Foundations, and one of the authors of a new report on the pandemic and working women, stated, "We've never built a workplace that worked for people with caregiving responsibilities." What needs to happen to make sure workplaces are more understanding of parents with childcare responsibilities?
I think in order to hold employers responsible and accountable, we really need acts from legislation to implement these measures and put in measures for parents and their children.
Yes, and that's badly needed. And, you know, as a lot of our audience knows, the public health crisis that was created by the COVID-19 pandemic forced many U.S. states to create a list of essential businesses that were the only type that were allowed to stay open. So there was two categories, essential and non-essential businesses. Was this legal?
Well, it's not for me to say whether it's legal or because quite frankly, we were all faced with something that our country was faced with such an acute crisis that no one has ever encountered. So we have to weigh the benefits versus the public safety and the safety of all of our citizens in the United States and worldwide, for that matter. So whether it's legal, essential, we needed these essential workers to continue the critical infrastructure operations and such. But whether it's legal or not is not for me to say. I think it's more of a policy issue that we were forced by circumstances to make.
Yes. Well, how about, where you draw the line, though, on what can stay open and what can't? Because there were cases where certain categories of businesses were allowed to stay open and others weren't.
That's a very good question. I think going forward, we now have precedent that we can base it on and sort of know where to draw the line. This is a very new emerging area of law, obviously COVID-19 related, whether it's unemployment matters, businesses being forced to close or forced to stay open, et cetera, et cetera. Where do we draw the line? I think there has to be a healthy compromise between keeping the public safe, yet keeping the public comfortable and getting the essential services that they need to thrive.
Yes. And there's definitely no right or wrong answer to that. I think, governmental entities, they were put into a very difficult position, and they had to create, these categories of what's essential and what's not. So it's a very difficult position to be in. And you're right. Now that we have this precedent, God forbid some point down the road this happens again, hopefully things can be done a little bit differently to make sure that it's done as equitably as possible. So
absolutely.
Now, universal voting rights are a topic that's very important to many. And I know that universal voting rights were recognized in Azerbaijan in 1918. And in Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founding president of the Turkish Republic, he led a secularist cultural and legal transformation supporting women's rights, including women voting and being elected. And women won the right to vote in municipal elections on March 20th, 1930. And women's suffrage was achieved for parliamentary elections on December 5th, 1934. Turkish women gained the right to vote a decade or more before women in such Western European countries such as France, Italy, and Belgium, a mark of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's far-reaching social changes. Currently, there are no Turkish American women elected to any state legislature or Congress. In the U.S., what can be done to encourage more Turkish American women to become more involved in the legislative process in the United States?
Mr. Gülistan, you're absolutely right. I think it's approximately only 24% of legislative members globally are women, and 17% women comprise the House and U.S. Senate. So I think women can successfully. What we need to do is diffuse their priorities throughout the legislative process in one of two ways. They can, one being, we need to have a higher percentage of women in office. So we need to get into office and not be discouraged by the process. And also perhaps the presence of a formal women's legislative caucus can help to get Turkish American women and all women across the country involved and in the legislature.
Yes, and thank you for that. And a little bit earlier in the program, we had discussed some of the challenges of the pandemic and this COVID-19 lockdowns. Oftentimes, whether it be a client or really anyone in society, whether they're experiencing a divorce, some sort of mental or emotional pain, what can we do to encourage more people to seek mental health professional services during times of crisis, such as a divorce, custody battle, or even during a pandemic?
Sure, Errol. I think we've come a long way as far as smashing the sort of taboo around mental health. Mental health is no different than your physical health if you're diabetic or have high blood pressure. But I think some people still feel that it's stigmatized or that it's taboo. So I think the more we discuss it and the more that it's brought out in media and social media, and us as attorneys, I think we can sort of tell our clients, listen, this is one of the most stressful things, particularly sort of on level with grieving the death of a family member. So you're grieving the death of a relationship, and it's okay to ask for help, and you need to have that support system in place. And maybe they may not feel comfortable with a therapist, it may be their pastor or the imam. I think the more we talk about it as a society and on a global scale,
Yes, and thank you for that. Now, in your opinion, what is the most uplifting thing happening in the world right now?
Wow. Most may think the pandemic is negative, and certainly is a negative, but I think a lot of positive has come out of this ordeal. I think it's forced us to reassess our interpersonal relationships. It's forced us to sit at a table for extended periods of time with family members and children and have a conversation and spend 24 hours, 7 days a week, weeks on end with our families. And we've learned to sort of bond again and communicate. And I think as a whole, everyone is starting to realize that although we can't socialize per se as far as going out and seeing our friends and giving them a hug, I think it's made us appreciate what we didn't appreciate before. So I think there's a lot of positive that has come out of the pandemic. And I think people have stopped and sort of slowed down and realized that, it's okay to stop and smell the roses, as cliche as that may sound. It's okay to slow down. I think we do have a much more relaxed pace for life. And I think there's a lot more empathy and sympathy because we're all experiencing and going through the same exact crisis with the same exact fears and anxieties.
Yes. And moving on to the next question. Can people with vastly different cultural backgrounds live together peacefully, and how?
I think that's very subjective. And I think that they can, with vastly different cultural backgrounds, absolutely live together, because at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all have the same emotions. We all have the same feelings. We all have the same blood running through our bodies. So absolutely, I don't see why that should be a challenge.
Yes, and I totally agree. We're a melting pot, both, the homelands and the motherlands. I mean, both the United States is what makes it great is that it's a melting pot. Same thing with, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. It's very much a melting pot of many different cultures and becomes one. So moving on to the next question, and this is one of my favorite questions. How important is science in the world we live in today?
I think that goes without saying that our society couldn't function without science. I mean, science and technology is all around us. You and I could not be having this conversation with right now had it not been for science. Had it not been for science, COVID-19 would have been on a much more disastrous trajectory. I mean, thank God we now have a vaccine available, and our ways of treating COVID-19 has come a long way, even in the short amount of time that we've had it. So yeah, the past year serves as a stark reminder that a pandemic like this can't be eradicated without science. So, because science is absolutely critical and crucial and essential in our lives.
Yes, and a lot of the advancement we have in society is thanks to it, as you mentioned. So thank you for your honesty on that. And one of the major themes of the show is how we can improve the world for the greater good of humanity for generations to come. How can we leave it better than we found it for the next generation? And what can we do to have a better world for that next generation?
I think what we really need to do is focus our energy on today's children. Instill them with notions of empathy, sympathy, equality, love, and respect for all, regardless of gender, heritage, orientation. And another thing that we really need to focus on is educating our children, because the children are the future, but not not necessarily math, science, and your core essentials, but just to be a good human being and to instill core values that sorry, I got a little emotional there as a mother. But I mean, just speaking as a mother with my two children, the most important thing is, of course, we want them to get an A on the math test, but I'd rather have his teacher say, well, your son, fended off a bully or stuck up for his best, his best friend. Because I think, that's not something that you can necessarily learn unless it's instilled at such a young age, and it needs to be throughout our society. And I think that's how we can make the world for the next generation a better place, is by focusing our energies on the children and realizing that we all need to be more empathetic, more sympathetic, and that's it.
And I agree with you. If the world had more empathy and more sympathy, I think it would help to resolve a lot of the ongoing outstanding issues that are out there. So absolutely. I agree with you. A lot more empathy and sympathy are needed in the world. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Now, what message would you like to send to Turkish American and Muslim Americans?
Oh, gosh, there's so much I'd want to say, but I guess for me, and what's gotten me through life, that my family has instilled in me, is that honesty integrity and a sound work ethic is what is the key to success. I mean, that is what makes you a successful human being, a successful person. Also, I think you really have to be passionate about what you do for a living or your career. Otherwise, this will start to negatively affect all aspects of your life. It's going to start to trickle down if you're not passionate about what you do. So never stop pursuing your dreams. It's never too late for anything.
Thank you so much for those, for your inspirational words. And thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. And before we conclude the show, I ask our audience to think about this very powerful quote from the legendary late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Women belong in all places where decisions are being made. It shouldn't be that women are the exception. Thank you for watching the show, and see you next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.